Welcome to APUSH, AP U.S. History. This is Chapter 18, and we'll be looking at the American West. Um, we'll be looking at the closing of the western frontier by about 1890. Um, Frederick Jackson Turner comes up with what he calls the frontier thesis, and by the way, this is the secret words for this video, the frontier thesis, which simply said that the West had a great deal in shaping the thinking of America. Its independence, its egalitarian attitudes, or that of equality among people, its expansionism, its treatment of those who stood in its way. So he believes that this rugged individualism comes from the West. And certainly did shape the character and the of America itself. Argued that opportunities were vanishing in America, needed to turn its attention overseas, and again another phase of manifest destiny. It shows a picture of Frederick Jackson Turner and the significance of the West on American society, which influences us today. When we look at the West, the first geographical figure that we come into is the Great Plains, often known as a desert. Not really a desert, but certainly miles and miles of grassland. There's a low rainfall, vast expanses of prairie land. And after the Civil War, whites will flood into this area and settle it. They are going to come in contact with Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Comanche, the Apaches, the Arapaho, and Nez Perce, Shoshone. All of these tribes will come in conflict with the white settlers. Eventually, they will be defeated and placed on reservations. By 1890, this western area, several states had been carved out of it, and there were 4 remaining territories to be settled. One of the things that induced people to go to the west was the Homestead Act, passed in 1862 during the Civil War. The Republicans enacted this to seek more support from the West. The Plains Indians certainly are someone we have to look at. In order to settle the West, they had to be subdued. It's a case of inferior societies meeting a superior society. We had the technology and the manpower. They pretty much were unorganized and primitive. And although they're going to put up a valiant effort, they're going to eventually lose in the end. The Plains Indians are organized in tribes. Buffalo was the main source of food on the plains. The tribes never fully organized against the whites, although initially they let whites pass through, but when the whites stopped off to settle the land, this is where the rub came. We've had a policy since Jackson in regulating Indian tribes and regarded tribes as separate nations and wards of the state. Most treaties, almost all treaties that were signed by Native Americans were violated by our government. Tribes were often victimized by corrupt government officials, particularly Indian agents who were stealing from them and selling and pocketing the money. They were forced onto reservations where they would receive an allotment or annuity every year, and sometimes the Indian agent would take this or shortchange the Indians and cause them to starve and die. We believe in the concentration theory, that is, that we wanted to put Indians on reservations. And of course, the Bureau of Indian Affairs were in charge of the reservation. And here shows some of the more prominent reservations uh, in the little starred areas in the west. Indian reservations today scattered throughout the United States, and you can see far more in the west than in the east. You find them also around the Great Lake areas and in Washington area and in some parts of California. Um, Government policy towards the Indians. Indians needed to surrender their land or else. They always wanted to be left alone, but weren't going to be because white men wanted their land or sometimes the gold that was on the land. But these annuities were paid to the Indians if they would peacefully live on reservations, and these reservations weren't necessarily the garden spots of the world. And some of these reservations today are still might be considered very poverty-struck areas, although that is changing with casinos. There was an attitude among white settlers that the only good Native American was a dead one. Conflict was inevitable. There are going to be some Indian wars that you're going to have to remember. One notable war was fought in Colorado. The Sand Creek Massacre. 400 women and children were executed by a colonel named Shivington, and this was akin to genocide. Why the Cheyenne and Arapaho were forced into Sand Creek was due to gold mining pressures in Colorado. And Shivington had an attitude that scalp them all, big and little. Little nits grow into be a lice, so kill them all. The Sioux War, which some of you remember, lasted from 1876 to 1877. This was fought between the American government and the Sioux Indians. Sitting Bull was the chief of the Sioux and went on the warpath because of white settlers invading the Black Hills, which was considered their sacred lands, because of gold. George Armstrong Custer will pursue the Sioux, and at the Little Bighorn, he will be wiped out along with his detachment. Sitting Bull will flee to Canada, but later surrender, and then later he'll be killed by some of his own people. This shows the Battle of the Bighorn, probably one of the more famous Indian battles fought in the West. General George Armstrong Custer made his reputation during the Civil War, and he'll be transferred to the West to subdue Indians. Another notable Indian war will be fought between Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce tribe in the Wallowa country in eastern Washington, eastern Oregon. White settlers wanted to push them off the land, and they weren't willing to go. War ensued, and the tribe won several battles. Chief Joseph will take his tribe and try to make it to Canada. After 75 days and 1,500 miles, he's defeated 30 miles from the Canadian border. Eventually, the Nez Perce are relocated in Oklahoma Territory, where other Indians, particularly the Cherokee and other tribes, were located. Many of them will die of disease. This shows the route from Oregon and the Wallowa country all the way up to the Canadian, or close to the Canadian border at Bear Paw. And here's where he says the famous quote, "I will fight no more forever." Wounded Knee will take place in 1890. Again, this is a clash between the U.S. troops and the Indians, the Sioux. The Sioux are practicing what they call the ghost dance, which is supposed to make them invincible to bullets. and this hope that this ghost dance would be able to wipe out the whites from the face of the earth. Well, the whites get a little nervous and urge the government to take some action and make this ghost dance illegal. Eventually, 300 women and children and men are massacred at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. Results of the Indian Wars. By 1890, all Indians are on reservation. Government felt it was cheaper to feed Indians than to fight them. Most of the time, the government sort of ignored them when they got there. The killing of the buffalo helped subdue the Indians. Their food source was taken. Railroads and repeating rifles are probably the two most prominent things that bring the demise of Western Indians. Of course, the national sentiment began to urge reform towards Native Americans later on. Not all felt that Indians were a nuisance. Helen Hunt Jackson, this is a person you'll need to know for the AP exam, wrote A Century of Dishonor, how the American Indian was treated poorly by the American government and white settlers, and how most of the treaties, almost every treaty, was violated by the government. This book had an emotional appeal to most citizens who say maybe we should assimilate the Indians into, or Native Americans into, the white man's culture. And so this will be the trend to destroy tribes and to incorporate Native Americans into the white culture. The Dawes Severalty Act, or the Dawes Act of 1887, started to bring this about. It dissolved tribes' legal title to the land, and the customs of the tribe are going to be done away with. This shows a picture of Helen Hunt Jackson and her book on poor treatment of Native Americans. Suzette LaFreche, Omaha Indians, lecture tour in Native American issues in the 1870s, talking about their ill treatment. The Dawes Severalty Act, the assimilation policy. One of the more notable schools, Indian schools, was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which tried to wipe out Indian connections to their tribal customs and the whole tribal tradition, make them good white people. There is going to be a push to allow Indians to own land, similar to the Homestead Act of 1862. It would give them 160 acres, designed to eradicate Indian culture. And if you could live on the land for 25 years, you could get title to the land and citizenship if you behave like good white settlers. Indians finally get their full citizenship in 1824 or 1924. This policy of assimilation, the Dawes Severalty Act, will be the policy of the government until FDR comes along in 1934, and this Reorganization Act will be passed to try to restore tribal custom and life. And we'll stop right there, and we'll pick this up next time when we talk about the mining.